It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the AOC Q24G2A/BK. As usual for a video review, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand using the monitor. As usual, there's a written review as well, which goes into more technical detail about the monitor, so if you're interested in that side of things, definitely check that out. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support. This monitor uses a 23.8-inch QHD, that's 2560 by 1440 or 1440p IPS panel, which I believe is a BOE IPS ADS part, but I'm not entirely sure. AOC doesn't disclose the exact panel used here. And this has a 165 Hz refresh rate. So it's a very interesting combination, having a gaming monitor that is 23.8 inches but has the QHD resolution. So this gives you a pretty tight pixel density. It's not as tight as a 32-inch or smaller 4K UHD monitor, but it's a bit tighter than the 27-inch QHD monitor. So you get a little bit of an edge. It's technically 13.5% or so tighter, the pixel density, compared to a 27-inch monitor with this resolution. It does give you a little bit of an edge, a bit of extra clarity. I wouldn't say it's a massive difference, but either way, text does have quite a crisp look, and suitably high resolution image content has a nice level of detail as well. And when you're looking at game content as well, again, it's not quite like the 4K UHD experience on a 32-inch or smaller screen, but it's still pretty good. And if you do happen to find text too small, you can use application-specific zoom, or you can use scaling in Windows. And with that, you do still benefit from the tight pixel density. You still get a nice level of clarity to text, just that everything's bigger, so you lose a bit of that desktop real estate. But of course, if things are more readable, then that's a worthwhile trade-off. Personally, I can use this very happily without any scaling, but I can use monitors with a significantly higher pixel density than this without scaling as well. It's just something I've got used to. And of course, the physical size of the screen is important. The 23.8-inch screen, some people do prefer the more compact size of a monitor like this. It keeps things more focused into your central region of vision, which can be nice for competitive gaming, for example. Or it might be that you're a bit tight on desk space, in which case this smaller size of monitor can be attractive as well. I'm now going to talk about the external features of the monitor. So the monitor has a slightly gamery look, typical AOC Gaming G series or G2 series look. So it has matte black plastic for the most part for the stand, the bottom bezel. It also has some red elements, and they are a dark red sort of metallic effect. It's difficult to see this in pictures and videos of the screen, but it's actually a bit darker than it looks in certainly the press shots of the monitor, so it sort of blends in a bit more than you might think. It certainly isn't a bright red. The stand offers full ergonomic flexibility, so you can tilt it, you can swivel it left and right, you can adjust the height, and you can pivot it into portrait. It has a reasonably solid feel actually for a budget monitor. It doesn't have excessive wobble when you tap it or anything like that. Feels reasonably solid. The monitor has what I would classify as a light matte anti-glare screen surface. So when you have strong direct light striking the screen surface, as I have here, you can sometimes get these sharp glare patches. It has a little bit of a glassy look. That doesn't happen too much though, certainly not in what I consider normal conditions, normal room lighting, really sensible room lighting. So decent glare handling overall. So with stronger matte screen surfaces, you tend to have more diffusion, which won't give you those kind of sharper glare patches so much, but it will spread the light across the screen more, and that can give you a flooded or hazy look. So there are some matte screen surfaces that do that more, heavier ones, and there's some that do that less than this one, very light matte screen surfaces as I would call them. So this one's really somewhere in the middle, a nice sort of middle ground if you like. And it also has a positive impact elsewhere when the screen is switched on, and I'll discuss that very shortly. At the rear, it continues that red and black colour scheme, so a few dark red metallic elements, not super bright, not really as bright as they tend to look on videos and photos of the monitor, but mainly matte black plastic. There are some nicely shaped ventilation slats for passive cooling at the top. They also house two 2-watt speakers. These are very basic speakers, just give you basic sound output. I say a little bit more about those in the written review. They're there if you need to use them, but don't expect amazing audio quality from these. The stand attaches centrally with a quick release mechanism, so you just push that catch up, and that will reveal 100 by 100mm VISA holes for alternative mounting. There's an elongated hexagonal cable tidy loop in the middle of the stand towards the bottom. There's also a K slot there. The ports face downwards as an HDMI 2.0 port, DisplayPort 1.2A, and a 3.5mm headphone jack, as well as an AC power input, so the monitor has an internal power converter. So you can find out more about the capabilities of the ports in the written review, but basically if you're using HDMI you're going to be limited to 144Hz maximum at the native QHD resolution. With DisplayPort you'll get up to 165Hz. You have adaptive sync support on both of those, so you can use AMD FreeSync as an AMD GPU or system user via HDMI and via DisplayPort. And on the NVIDIA side, you've got NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, which this monitor is officially certified for, and you can use that via DisplayPort. I'm on Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor has a contrast ratio of around 1000:1. I measured just a touch above that with my test settings, and that involves some changes to colour channels, which just reduce the static contrast just a little bit, compared to if you have them at their neutral value of 50 for each channel. So this is really in line with the specifications for the panel. It's very typical IPS performance. Some are a bit stronger than this, some are a bit weaker. It doesn't give you strong depth and inkiness. It doesn't give you the kind of look you get on a decent VA model, and certainly not an OLED or anything like that. And you also have to consider the fact that there is IPS glow to contend with, which affects the depth and atmosphere. You'll be able to see that at the moment. It's most noticeable as a haze towards the corners of the screen, usually the bottom corners from a normal viewing position, a bit more, but it depends on your viewing position. On this monitor, it generally has a slightly warm, slightly golden quality to it, but it can be a little bit of a cool silver depending on where you're looking and your viewing position as well. It can also be brought out more strongly if you're sitting closer to the screen, if you're using a high brightness level, and if you have a unit with significant issues with backlight bleed or clouding. I explore my unit in that respect in the written review in the contrast and brightness section, but I do mention there that my unit does have a bit of backlight bleed and clouding, mainly towards the bottom right corner. So some of what you see is not just IPS glow, there's also an influence of the clouding and backlight bleed. A strength of IPS type panels like this is strong gamma consistency. So what that means is if you consider the dark detail levels, yes, they are affected in the regions affected by IPS glow, but they're quite well maintained, the detail levels throughout the screen. You don't get the kind of vertical shifts you get with TN models. And VA models, they can have black crush centrally, which means that dark shades are even darker than they should be, and they blend together into a sort of black mass. Whereas peripherally, on some VA models, you get an excess of detail, so that can give a blocky or banded appearance, and this can be even more noticeable when you're looking at heavily compressed streamed content. This monitor doesn't have any particular issues in that respect. Considering the brighter shades now, when you're looking at them, you can observe a bit of graininess from the screen surface, but it's what I would describe as a light, misty graininess rather than a heavy or smeary graininess, and there isn't a lot of layering to the screen surface, so what that means is you're not really so aware of the screen surface, or as aware as you would be on some matte screen surfaces which are stronger or more aggressive than this. So this is what I classify as a light matte anti-glare screen surface. It's going to be something which many people are going to be quite happy with. Even if you sometimes notice graininess on monitors, you might find this one just fine. It's something I'm very sensitive to, so yes, I do notice it, but again, it's what I would describe as a light misty graininess, so not too obtrusive. I've brightened the room up a bit. It's brighter than it was before. It's not exactly a bright room, but it's just bright enough to talk about and slightly show you the effect of brightening the room up. It does take the edge off the IPS glow, and it makes the weaknesses in static contrast less noticeable. That's not to say it's going to look the same as a monitor with much stronger contrast, even in these lighter conditions, although if the room's bright enough, it reaches a certain point where they're really very difficult to distinguish, even this versus an OLED, for example, with a similar screen surface. So with this in mind, and the fact that the room lighting can help, I would recommend that if you like to sit in a darker room, or your room is otherwise dim for whatever reason, then perhaps consider some bias light or just some lighting behind the monitor that can really help give an edge in perceived contrast. I'm now going to explore the colour reproduction of the monitor, and to start off I like to look at lagom.nl and the tests for viewing angles to explore the idea of colour consistency. So the lagom text then, that would ideally appear a blended grey throughout the screen. On this model it does appear quite blended, a little bit of red to the striping or pink to the striping of the text, and it's a bit more colourful towards the extreme edges of the screen, but there aren't obvious shifts between saturated red and orange and green, as you would see on models with weaker viewing angle, and if you move your head a bit, it doesn't sort of flash different colours, and this indicates a low viewing angle dependency to the gamma curve of the monitor, as you'd expect from a good IPS type model. The purple block always appears odd on the video. It looks like there's some weird pink ball in the middle and it looks more purple or blue towards the edges. It doesn't actually look like to the eye. To the eye, it looks consistent, slightly pinkish purple throughout the screen. It is a bit pinker towards the extreme edges of the screen, but this isn't an extreme shift. The red block, that looks quite a consistent and fairly rich red throughout the screen, a little bit duller towards the extreme edges, but again, not an extreme shift and better than you would see on VA or TN models in terms of these shifts. The green block appears a good consistent yellowish green chartreuse throughout the screen. The blue block, that appears a good royal blue throughout the screen, just a touch darker towards the extreme edges, but that really is a very subtle shift. I'm on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about colour reproduction using some in-game examples. So that strong consistency has a positive effect here, maintains the vibrancy and the richness throughout the screen. So a shade in the middle of the screen looks largely the same as that same shade displayed towards the edges of the screen. You have to remember that content like this, so this is a game running an SDR, remember this is an SDR only monitor, it doesn't have any HDR support. It is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. It's the same if you're just casually browsing the internet or you're watching a movie. It will be designed in most cases with the sRGB colour space in mind. If you're using a gamut on the monitor that extends beyond that, then you get extra vibrancy and extra saturation. So the gamut of this one you can see on the screen, it sticks quite close to sRGB for the most part. There's a bit of extension beyond it in the red region and a little bit of underextension in the green region. So what this means is that some red biased shades have a bit more pop to them, but it doesn't have the kind of strong extra saturation you get with a wide gamut monitor, a traditional wide gamut monitor. This really still is a standard gamut monitor. There's a little bit of extension beyond sRGB for those red shades. So I look at these earthy browns, for example, and they look fairly neutral. There's just a little bit of a red push. It isn't as strong or intense as it is on some models. The woods of those crates there as well, the palettes, and the painted red there. It doesn't have a strong extra vibrancy and saturation, just a bit of extra pop. The green shades for the grass and some of the vegetation, it looks quite natural, quite in place, without looking overly bright or sometimes neon, depending on the colour gamut of the monitor. Some wide gamut monitors can really give a lot of extra pop to some of these shades. So overall, this is a look which some would like. I know some people do like the extra pop and saturation of a wide gamut monitor, and that isn't offered here, but the overall look is what I would describe as rich and natural. And also the sky blues, it's worth noting that they can look quite overdone on some monitors. In this case, they don't. If you want things to stick even closer to sRGB, or more to the point, not extend beyond it in the red region, then you can use the sRGB mode of the monitor. So you change colour temp to sRGB. It's a very inflexible sRGB mode. You can't adjust the colour channels, although that's not unusual. And the balance on my unit in that respect was not too bad. You can't change gamma either, but the biggest restriction is brightness. That's locked to the default setting of 70. It's around 250 nits. You can see the exact figure in the written review and more testing related to this mode. So yeah, that's moderately high. It's higher than some people would like, and it's not as high as some people would like. So it's just a lack of flexibility. It's not a good thing to have this locked like that. But in this case, it doesn't exactly make a dramatic difference, or it's not needed as much as it would be on a wide gamut monitor. And the actual gamut, I'm going to put that on the screen. You can see that there's some undercoverage of sRGB as well. So it's not ideal having such a lack of flexibility, having some sRGB undercoverage, but the overall representation is decent overall, and it does tone down those red shades if that's something you're interested in. If you're using this monitor for colour critical work, you can certainly do that within the sRGB colour space, but I would recommend, and I would generally recommend this anyway, calibration with your own colorimeter or similar device for the best performance. There are some ICC profiles you can test out if you want. You can find them in the written review in the calibration section. But this isn't a wide gamut monitor, so you're not going to be able to do any accurate colour work within the Adobe RGB or DCI-P3 colour spaces, for example. But again, for colour critical work in general, for the sRGB space in mind. The strong colour consistency is also helpful there to maintain good accuracy throughout the screen and not just for the central point that you might be calibrating. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. This monitor has 165Hz refresh rate. I've got the game running at 165 frames a second, pretty solidly. So it's pumping out up to 2.75 times as much information as a 60Hz monitor, or this running at 60Hz or 60 frames a second. So this high frame rate, high refresh rate combination gives you a few key advantages. One is that it greatly improves the connected feel. That's the precision and fluidity you feel when you're interacting with your character, interacting with the game world. That's also aided by low input lag. In this case, I measured around 1.5 milliseconds of input lag, so really impressively low. That indicates a very low signal delay and extremely low signal delay. That's the main element of input lag you feel. So it's really nice to see such a low level of input lag here. The other thing that relatively high frame rate and refresh rate combination does for you, it reduces the perceived blur due to eye movement from the monitor. So perceived blur, that is an important concept, and it's explored more in an article on the website all about monitor responsiveness, and there's a bit of a summary in the written review in the responsiveness section if you're not familiar with this. Definitely worth checking that out. But most of the perceived blur you see on a monitor is due to the eye movement, and it's tightly linked to the refresh rate. The other aspect of perceived blur, which is also important consideration, comes from the pixel responses of the monitor. And you can use a photography technique, which I like to use, called pursuit photography, using test UFO or the UFO motion test for ghosting. And that demonstrates both aspects of perceived blur very nicely. So I'm going to show you some pursuit photographs on the screen. The monitor's running at 165Hz, its maximum supported refresh rate here. There are examples in the written review from various other lower refresh rates if you're interested in that. And I've tested all of the different overdrive settings as off, weak, medium and strong. I've also included a reference screen, the Gigabyte M27Q. That's running at 170Hz, but this makes a negligible difference versus 165Hz, so it's a good comparison here. It's also a good reference screen because it isn't the fastest IPS model out there, it's not the slowest either, but it's at a comfortable level, a level which most people are very happy with in terms of its responsiveness. So if a monitor can match or come close to that, it's good. If it can provide a better performance, then that's going to be very welcome, and most people are going to be very happy with that. So the AOC here, I like to use the overdrive set to medium. That's the optimal setting in my view for 165Hz, but people might have their own preferences. You can see the strong setting, it does give some more noticeable overshoot, some halo trailing that's bright and can be seen behind the UFOs. I wouldn't say this is the most extreme overshoot I've seen. It certainly isn't the most extreme overshoot I've seen, especially using the fastest overdrive setting on a monitor. So some people might find this okay, especially for competitive gaming with simple graphics. I prefer medium though, it gives a nicer balance for me. And with this you can see just a little bit of light powdery trailing behind the UFOs, but actually less than you can see with the M27Q, so it's a really good level you can see here, really good level of responsiveness. Consider a broader range of transitions. You can see some more differences between the weak and medium setting than perhaps is highlighted here, although if you look at the middle row, that's the medium background, compare weak to medium, you can actually see a bit more of a bold initial trail for the weak setting, which does indicate slower pixel responses. But overall, I don't find the overshoot obnoxious with the medium setting. I do find a bit of a reduction in perceived blur in places for some transitions, which I do like. So sticking with my preferred medium setting, what that means in practice is that the monitor provides a very competent pixel response performance. The weaknesses are on the minor side, much as shown with Test UFO. The greatest weaknesses will occur where there are bright shades against a contrasting background. So if you can see white text in a game and bright or saturated, highly saturated, doesn't have to be bright, it can be white or highly saturated HUD elements, for example, or markers against a darker background, that's when you might notice some of this a bit more. And you do just get it in places where there are just mixtures of brighter and darker shade, but it's not like a smeary trail or anything like that. It's not even what I describe as a heavy powdery trail. It's faint, it sticks close to the object, nothing really stands out when you're just using the monitor normally, and it only adds a little bit to perceived blur rather than a huge amount. Some overshoot is a bit more noticeable for some transitions and shown with Test UFO using my preferred medium setting, but none of it is strong overshoot, nothing that really stands out and slaps me in the face. When I'm not really actively looking for it and I'm just playing the game normally, I don't really find it bothersome. I'm on a different scene on Battlefield 5 now, and I'm going to talk about responsiveness using some slightly different transitions. So The scene I was showing you before was mainly brighter to medium transition with a few darker shades mixed in. This has more of a focus now, this scene, on darker shades with contrasting backgrounds. So yes, there are some of the more noticeable weaknesses I mentioned before, but when I say noticeable, they're still on the minor side. And it's really the overshoot, to be honest, is the main sort of thing that could stand out if you're sensitive to it. But for these transitions, which really show some of the strongest overshoot you'll observe on this monitor, there's nothing that really jumps out in an obvious way. You probably can't even see it on the video, in fact. Just a little bit of light halo trailing. It's a little bit brighter than the background shade around the flag, for example, so it could potentially stand out if you're sensitive to it, but it's certainly not a major issue in this case. And yes, just a little bit of a mask of perceived blur from slightly slower than optimal pixel transitions in some cases, but nothing dramatic at all. The monitor also supports VRR, variable refresh rate, specifically adaptive sync. You can use AMD FreeSync. AOC claims it should be AMD FreeSync Premium certified at some point. I'm not sure, but the certification, I wouldn't stress too much about it. It won't actually affect the performance, which I have tested in some detail myself. I've also used NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode, so you can use AMD FreeSync via DisplayPort or HDMI. G-Sync compatible mode on this one, DisplayPort only. I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment, and what this does for you is it gets rid of tearing and stuttering from frame and refresh rate mismatches. So it tries to keep the refresh rate of the monitor synchronized with the frame rate of the content. So I've now got the game running at 120 frames a second, so I can talk about this a little more, because something you have to be aware of is an increase in overshoot, especially if you're using the medium setting or indeed the strong setting for overdrive. It can be that you can notice quite a bit of overshoot as the refresh rate decreases. At this level, I'm sort of borderline between thinking that maybe I should use the weak setting instead to cut down on the overshoot. My general recommendation, though, definitely would be if you're in the double digits. I'm not quite there yet, but if you dip frequently into the double digits, or let's just say you go much below 120 Hz quite a lot of the time, you might want to just stick to the weak setting. So I'm just going to switch over to that now. So that does cut down on the overshoot a lot. Adds a little bit of extra powdery trailing in places, but like I showed with Test UFO, it still performs well, to be honest. So it might be that you just like to use this setting anyway. If you find that you're playing a wide variety of games or lots of different scenes in your games and your frame rate's all over the place, just stick to weak. Just give it a go. It might be quite nice for you. And the pixel response requirements for optimal performance do reduce as your refresh rate decreases. So I've got the game running at 80 frames a second now, and the monitor is running at 80 Hz, and I'm using the weak setting. To be honest, this provides really a nice performance here. I could bump up to medium, I'm just going to do that, bump up to the medium setting just to show you the overshoot. So what I find now is that overshoot is pretty strong. You'll hopefully be able to see this around the tree and the flag post on the video. Some dirty trailing, which is darker than the background shade, actually close to black around the street lamp there. So for me, this overshoot outweighs any benefit I get in reduction in perceived blur, because that is really very slight at this point, whereas the overshoot is pretty eye-catching. So the weak setting is definitely my preference now. I'm now running at 60 Hz. The overshoot is even stronger around the makeshift roof there, the flag and the tree, and of course that lovely dirty trailing. And when the monitor goes below 55 Hz or so, 55 frames a second in your game, you've got VRR active, LFC, low frame rate compensation, is used. That's what AMD refers to it. And NVIDIA has a very similar technology. And what this does is it ensures that the refresh rate of the monitor sticks to a multiple of the frame rate. So if your game's running at 40 frames a second, for example, the monitor could be running at 80 Hz, keeps the tearing and stuttering at bay. There's a slight momentary stuttering when the LFC boundary is crossed in either direction, but that's not specific to this monitor. It's something which you will always observe with adaptive sync. So it basically extends the effective range of operation. It could potentially be a problem if you're frequently passing the boundary because of this momentary stuttering, and also the changes in overshoot behavior, because you could suddenly be going from 55 Hz to 80 Hz plus, so there would be a change in overshoot, a reduction in overshoot, or an increase if you go in the other direction, if that makes sense. So I suppose it could be a bit jarring, but for most people you're not really going to be frequently passing this boundary. You're going to be just one side or the other, hopefully above it most of the time. And yes, the claimed floor operation for this monitor is 48 Hz, I'm aware of that, but in my testing it with AMD and NVIDIA, the technology worked in much the same way on both my AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. It seemed to be more like 55 Hz, or just a little bit below that the floor operation was. Then it switched to LFC. The monitor also has a strobe backlight setting called MBR, motion blur reduction. You can't use that at the same time as VRR, but you can use it instead. That is something which is not good to explore in a video. All you can see is weird flickering. You can't see the advantages, but it is explored in some detail in the written review in terms of its brightness, in terms of what it actually does, in terms of pursuit photography and the subjective impressions I give there. Definitely worth checking that out if you're interested in strobe backlight modes. And just to summarize though, the strobe backlight setting on this monitor is quite good because it's flexible in terms of its brightness and other settings on the monitor that you can configure. And it's just quite well tuned actually. It doesn't give a huge amount of strobe crosstalk or a massive amount of overshoot. It's not perfect because there is a bit of both of those things, but really for the main central region of the screen, which is where you're focusing on mainly when you're gaming competitively, it's going to give you a pretty good performance actually. And if you like strobe backlight modes, it reduces the perceived blur, then this is a pretty decent strobe backlight mode, all things considered. To wrap up then, good ergonomics. The design of the monitor, I think it's pretty inoffensive really. Mainly matte black plastic, a few red elements. They don't tend to stand out as much as they actually you might think from videos and pictures, particularly press shots of the monitor where it looks like a brighter red. Sort of blends in a bit better than you might expect. So don't worry too much if red's not your colour, because I don't think these are really too bright and flashy. The contrast performance of the monitor, as expected for the panel type, really very sort of middle of the row as far as IPS models go. There were some stronger and some weaker. And the IPS glow was much as expected as well for a panel of this size, an IPS type panel of this size. Something which I explore in the written review as well. I do talk about brightness, adjustment range, and the brightness levels that you can achieve on the monitor. And it is worth noting that it's actually pretty good on this one. Pretty close to 400 nits maximum, and the minimum is 64 nits. The colour performance benefits from the strong colour consistency of the IPS type panel. I wouldn't say it's the very strongest IPS model I've used in that respect, but the weaknesses were very much on the minor side still. Certainly an IPS type panel, very clear when I was using it that it was an IPS type panel, because the shifts in saturation are very much on the minor side. The colour gamut extends just a little bit beyond sRGB in the red region, so it gives a little bit of an extra pop in places, but nothing like a traditional wide gamut monitor would give you. Sticks closer to sRGB than that. If you want to stick even closer to sRGB, then the sRGB emulation mode might be worth considering, but it does lock your brightness to a moderately high level. It's just very inflexible in that respect. It also gives a bit of undercoverage, so it's not exactly ideal, but it might just give a look which some people prefer, and it's there if you want to use it. And for colour critical work, certainly the monitor can be used for that within the sRGB colour space, but it's no good for wide gamut work. Responsiveness of the monitor, I was pretty impressed with that actually. Very low input lag, good 165 Hz performance with pretty strong pixel responses overall. Only minor weaknesses really. VRR worked as well, adaptive sync with AMD FreeSync and NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode working as I'd hope. There is an increase in overshoot if you're using the medium or strong setting. You might notice that, particularly if you're dipping into the double digits, but I find it a bit around 120 Hz or below. But the good news is that the weak setting on this monitor, it works pretty well throughout the range really. It actually gives you a decent performance even at higher refresh rates, and for lower refresh rates you're going to get relatively low overshoot, and it's really going to perform very well there. So by some people's definition you could actually consider this a single overdrive mode experience, but for me personally that would need really tighter tuning where things performed like the medium setting at the higher refresh rates and like the weak setting at lower refresh rates, rather than you having to switch for the optimal setting. But as I said, the weak setting might just work for some people throughout the range anyway. So overall, this monitor is really intriguing because of its combination of 23.8-inch screen size and the resolution and refresh rate. This is a rare combination. The last time I looked at a model which had this kind of combination, I think it was the Dell S2417DG, and there was a similar AOC model or monitor using a similar TN panel. So these were TN panels. The IPS model of this one, it does give a significant upgrade in terms of colour. Overall, I'd say it holds its own when it comes to responsiveness. It was a long time since I looked at those TN models, and actually, if I recall correctly, the AOC version wasn't actually that amazing in terms of pixel responses. It had some sort of standout weaknesses. I think that this monitor really is just quite well rounded when you look at the overall performance in terms of responsiveness and image quality. And of course you have to factor in the price. The retail price of this one, it's supposed to be around £220, similar price in euros. So this is actually really affordable for the specs on offer, and because it's such a unique product, I mean, it's hard to really compare it like for like. The issue though is availability. Because it's such a unique product, the demand is greatly outstripping supply at the time of review. This might be different depending on when you're viewing the video, so I do hope that this smooths out and you can actually buy this monitor easily at a decent price. I also would like to see it launched in other markets such as the US, big market there for gaming monitors, and this one I think would fit in really nicely there. So hopefully AOC's US division pays attention and does launch it over there, so I'd really like to see that. So that's really all there is to the AOC Q24G2A/BK. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Also be aware that liking the video and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they're nice ways of showing your support.